Good morning, and thank you for joining me for another 5 Good Minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Psalms of David that have historical notations in the superscription and help provide us a fuller understanding of David's biography. We're in Psalm 56 today, and the superscription of this psalm says, "To the choir master, according to the tune, the dove on the far-off terebinth trees, a miktam of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath." Okay, so we have a companion piece to Psalm 34 that we dealt with a few days ago, written at about the same time when David was on the run from Saul. In early days, he had not yet gone to the cave at Adullam. He hadn't drawn to himself his band of 600 followers, 600 men. This is very early days. He really is a renegade. There are 8 of those renegade psalms. We've looked at most of them. We have a few more to look at. And this one is especially interesting. Such a beautiful psalm. I want to just go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk about it. Just 11 verses. 13 verses. Psalm 56. "Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemy tramples on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept account of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not already in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. Then I know that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render my thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. Just the language, the visual imagery, just the beauty of this psalm and the vividness of it. He's afraid, and he says he's afraid. And he does such an effective job of describing how he feels like a hunted animal. People are lurking. They're watching his steps. They're waiting for his life. They're trampling on him. He says that more than once. He repeats that they're trampling on me all day long. But he also repeats, "In you I trust. In God I trust. In Yahweh." Invoking Yahweh's name I trust. He begins and ends the psalm that way. It's interesting that in the first verse he's asking for grace, which is an intimation that he doesn't believe he necessarily deserves the things he's asking for, but he's asking for them anyway. It's also interesting that he asks God to keep his feet from stumbling, that he himself is afraid he might be guilty of moral error and therefore not innocent any longer, and deserving of perhaps the bad things that are about to happen to him. He talks in the end about God's deliverance. I'm not sure whether this is written looking back on the deliverance that he's already asked for. In other words, whether it's an addition at the end of the song, an extra verse, or whether he's remembering his past, all the many times in his past that God has saved him, the way he does in Psalm 22. He hasn't received deliverance yet in Psalm 22, but he has confidence in it because of his past relationship with God. I just love the phrase that he uses, that he'll use later again, when he's an old man fleeing from his son Absalom. You know, I am protected by God. I won't be afraid of anybody. What can they do to me? And also, what he says in verse 8, such a beautiful image. Put my tears in your bottle, referring to what's called a lacrimal. Lacrimal would be a bottle, a little stoppered bottle, in which someone would collect their tears, and then they'd give them to someone that they cared about, and that was perhaps the greatest treasure they could receive, was the tears of someone that they cared about, because the tears represented the deepest feelings, the deepest emotion, contained the deepest expression of the person. And that was something that was practiced in the ancient world up through medieval times and became popular again in the Victorian era. And that he describes God as having a lacrimal, to keep David's tears in. It's such a vivid image. And then he says God's book, God's writing, God's record is a lacrimal. It's already filled with David's tears. And I've often thought of the Bible itself as a lacrimal that contains David's tears and the tears of everybody that suffered, that we have an account of in the Bible. Not only the women who lost their children in Bethlehem, but Jesus himself and everyone else from Genesis to Revelation who suffered. It's all right here in this book, which is God's lacrimal too. Well, as a young man on the run, David expresses to us all the vulnerability in his heart and also all the confidence he has in God in such beautiful, beautiful language. I hope that before we end, you did not fail to notice that he wants God to act in God's own wrath against his enemies. There's that too. Well, thank you for joining us for what has now become 7 good minutes today. We will look at Psalm 57 tomorrow.